Welcome. I'd like to talk about modes today. Now, modes actually have been in existence for a long time. Actually, ancient Greece, 500 BC. And the Greeks are the foundation of almost everything Western, including Western music. So 500 BC, modal music is being used, and we're going to talk about that today. And after the Greeks, the Roman Empire still used modes. After the Roman Empire, throughout the Middle Ages, the whole medieval period was based on modal music theory. Even through most of the Renaissance, we find modes as the predominant basis for music composition. It isn't until the beginning of the Baroque era, end of Renaissance, beginning of the Baroque era, around 1400, that we have the invention, the discovery of major, minor tonality. So what we typically, because that's what's in use all the way till today, what we assume as major and minor, those are terms that only came into existence, that only were really discovered by composers at the beginning of the Baroque era, hundreds of years ago. That said, the use of modes kind of fell away for a long time, and then was somewhat rediscovered in the late 19th century. And people would call it maybe neo-modality or new modality, or would take the modes and put them within a tonal harmonic context. And nowadays, we hear about modes most typically if you're studying jazz music. And that's really the only place where it's really commonly discussed today. But that said, you will find it in more upper level music theory courses because its applications are both important historically and how they can be folded in to the music theory and compositional techniques of today. So with that, let's get started. We have 7 modes, and Ionian is often considered the first mode. Let me give you an example of the notes in the Ionian mode. So C, D, E, F, G, A, B would be an example of the Ionian mode. Now, I know you're let down and disappointed because this is nothing all that new to you. This is our major scale. What's interesting is we had modes, and out of the modes, one was selected to represent major tonality, and it happened to be the Ionian mode. If you look closely and we analyze this mode, we can analyze it in terms of the whole steps and half steps. So whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, and then if we go back to C at the top, we can say half step. We can analyze it based on its first note. So C to D would be a major second, C to E would be a major third, C to F, a perfect fourth, C to G, a perfect fifth, C to A, a major sixth, C to B, a major seven. And so that's how you would analyze what makes up an Ionian scale or the Ionian mode. What are the characteristics that are distinctly Ionian? So if we listen to that, there's no surprises there. The Dorian mode, and the idea behind modes, and this is super simplistic, is that if we just were to take this, our major scale, and just start on a different note of the scale, use the exact same pitches, but start on a different note. So what makes C major is that C is our foundational pitch. So to have a key, not only do we have a scale, we have a pitch, and that pitch, through its frequency, through its rhythmic placement, when you start with C and then go elsewhere and then come back to C, that type of setup, repetition, where you start, where you end, will imply and make C sound like the hook, the foundational part, the anchor, so to speak. and then all the other pitches go around it. But if we take all the same pitches, but instead make D the anchor, your starting and ending pitch, and just say, well, let's take the same letters from the C Ionian scale, but start and end on D. So D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D. Well, now we have a different collection of half steps, whole steps, and different relationships of the beginning note with the pitches that go above it. The intervals will be different, and that gives it a completely different character. So I can play the C major scale with a C down here, but if I play the D instead, it sounds different. It has a different emotional feeling to it. The Greeks would go insofar as to say that this played into the concept of ethos, and that different modes would inspire different feelings, and so certain modes would lend themselves to certain types of feelings and uses. So the Dorian mode was considered warlike. If you were going to march off to battle, you should write something in the Dorian mode. Give that a try, see what happens. If we analyze it, we'll find that we have a major second, D, E, major second, D to F is a minor third, D to G, a perfect fourth, D to A, a perfect fifth, D to B, a major sixth, D to C, a minor seven. So let's look and examine what's different between Ionian and Dorian. Both have a major second. However, the third note is different. In Ionian, you have a major third. In Dorian, a minor third. The fourth is the same. The fifth is the same. The sixth is the same. The seventh is different. So the only difference between Ionian and Dorian is the third and the seventh, that relationship. So in Dorian, you have a minor third and a minor seventh, whereas in Ionian, you have major for the third and seventh. Dorian is considered a minor mode because of the third. Whether a mode is major or minor is really determined by what kind of third it has. You will notice that Dorian is not the minor mode that was chosen to represent minor in major-minor tonality. It was not considered minor enough. So let's see if we can continue analyzing this and figure out why, or at least keep that in the back of your mind. When we get to Phrygian, the idea is we start on the E. So this is why we have these numbers. Ionian is considered the first mode, Dorian the second, Phrygian is the third mode. So Ionian first, Dorian second, Phrygian third mode. And we just take the same notes that we used, our C major scale, and we just rewrite them now with E as your beginning and ending. So E, F, G, A, B, C, D, E. And so we'll just put a line here to distinguish. When we're looking at Phrygian mode, Phrygian mode is often heard in Spanish music. And what makes it so unique? Well, it has a minor second. That separates it from both Ionian and Dorian already. It has a minor third, a perfect fourth, a perfect fifth, a minor sixth, first time we were seeing that, and a minor seventh. So that is the intervallic makeup of Phrygian. And we can see again, as we're examining the different modes, how these intervallic differences are apparent, and how when we listen to them, they have a different emotional feeling to them. So the music throughout ancient Greece, Rome, Middle Ages, and much of the Renaissance was all centered on using modes. Now there was all sorts of complicated rules on what note to start on, what would be your recitation tone, where you could like repeat notes and revolve, and the range, how high you could go, how low you could go. That was also considered really important in modal music theory. I know I thought modes were just, you just take a scale and start on a different note. Modes, ta-da! When I was doing my graduate work at New York University, I went to the library and opened up a book on modal music theory, and my head exploded. I couldn't believe how complicated it was. So again, just please keep in mind, we're scratching the surface. But let's keep going, because we're still making some very important insights. The Lydian mode is considered the fourth mode. It would start on the F, if we're going to be just using our notes C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. So F, G, A, B, C, D, E, F. This has a major second, a major third, a augmented fourth, an augmented interval. That's going to be unusual. That's our first yet. A perfect fifth, a major sixth, and a major seven. Now, both Ionian and Lydian are considered major modes because they have the major third. But when tonality came around, they did not choose Lydian. They had this augmented fourth, and that didn't quite make it. So listen to the sound of this. That's your sound of Lydian. That B drives up to the C, as opposed to if this were F major from tonality, that would be a B flat. It would drive you down to the A, the third. And there's a lot of reasons if we look at music history as to why that happens. But let's keep on track for now and go to Mixolydian. So Mixolydian, G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Let's analyze it intervallically. The second is a major second, then a major third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, major sixth, minor seven. So it's very similar to our Ionian mode. The only difference is the seventh. The seventh is minor in the case of Mixolydian. Here we come up to Aeolian. And Aeolian is the minor mode that was chosen for tonality. So A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A. So it has a major second, minor third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, minor sixth, minor seven. And though that, and if you look at, if I were to just take a quick guess, the difference between Dorian and Aeolian is just the six. But if you're looking for how different can you get from Ionian, well, still having the fundamental pitches and intervals you need for chords to move, like we need a perfect fifth. That 5-1 relationship is so important. We need that, and having this kind of this beginning scale, this what the Greeks would call tetrachord, 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 note, where you have 1, 2 major second. But getting our minor third and our minor sixth, minor seven, that's really sufficient to give us that minor feeling. Now, interestingly, this Locrian mode, okay, the seventh mode, was considered only a theoretical mode for a long time. It wasn't really used. And why don't you just take a look at it and see if you can figure out why. The notes would be B, C, D, E, F, G, A, B. Let's listen to it here. That's our Locrian mode. Why would this be fairly unused throughout most of this period where modes were being used? Well, if you listen closely to what I just said a second ago about how important that fifth is, you'll see why. The Locrian mode has a diminished fifth, no perfect fifth. And the absence of that fifth was pretty much a deal breaker. So, as we analyze Locrian mode, it has a minor second, minor third, perfect fourth, diminished fifth, minor sixth, and minor seventh. Let's just quickly review. In jazz, they often use the major scale as your foundation. So you'll say Ionian is the first mode of the major scale. Dorian is the second mode of the major scale. And by second mode, that means that you're just starting on the second note of the major scale, gives you the Dorian intervallic makeup. And that Phrygian is the third mode of the major scale. Lydian is the fourth mode of the major scale. Mixolydian is the fifth mode of the major scale. Aeolian is the sixth mode of the major scale. And Locrian is the seventh mode of the major scale. In jazz theory, Locrian is used. Let's listen just one more time so we can hear the difference. I'm going to play the bass note is the first note of the mode. So here's Ionian. Here's Dorian. Phrygian. That was Lydian. Here's Mixolydian. Aeolian. And finally Locrian. And when we have modal music in jazz, because jazz actually starts off more with major minor tonality, then in the late 50s, 1959, and then throughout the 60s, you have people like Miles Davis and John Coltrane experimenting with modal jazz, where they'll take a chord using one of these modes and just play over it for an extended period of time. So instead of having chord changes that change fairly frequently, which is what was common in jazz and common in much classical music, they would spend, let's say, 8 full measures on the Dorian mode. And so you can experiment with the sound of these modes by just playing on the piano or guitar and trying to get a sense of how those modes work. So that gives you a sense of one way of analyzing modes. But let's look at another way. So we have our Ionian mode, and let's stick with our C major scale there. And we will analyze it as just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The C would be 8, but it's a repeat, so we don't need to know that for our purposes. So that is our C major scale. And so these numbers can represent scale degrees, but for our purposes, they're the scale degrees of the major scale. Now, instead of just starting on a different note of our C major scale to generate our other modes, let's do what essentially make them all parallel. So let's start on C and say, well, what would the notes of C Dorian be? Here's where you're going to want to remember that the difference, or the formula, as compared to, would be 1, 2, lowered third, 4, 5, 6, lowered 7, because Dorian had a minor third and a minor 7. Other than that, it had the same intervals as a major scale. So if we remember that, we can very quickly write out the notes: C, D, E flat, F, G, A, B flat. And that is our Dorian mode. the intervallic makeup. And again, we're taking a formula here and saying, assuming a major scale, what alterations need to be done to turn it into one of our modes. So to turn a major scale into a Phrygian mode, we go 1, lowered 2, lowered 3, 4, 5, lowered 6, lowered 7. Again, what's critical is, what are you starting with? The answer in this case is a major scale, and what alterations to go to what. So if I lower the 2nd, 3rd, 6th, and 7th note of the C major scale, I will get a C Phrygian scale. C, D flat, E flat, F, G, A flat, and B flat. For Lydian, the formula 1, 2, 3, raised 4, 5, 6, 7. And therefore the pitches, if I start on C, would be C, D, E, F sharp, G, A, B. Now, just like when you're working on learning all 15 major scales, it is good to write them all out. You can do the same with all of your modes. You can write out your modes in every single, based on every single starting note. So C, C sharp, D, etc., E flat, F, E, F, F sharp, and some of the enharmonics that are going to be commonly found like F sharp and G flat. If we keep going and looking at Mixolydian, the formula for Mixolydian would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, lowered 7, which would be, if we do start on C, C, D, E, F, G, A, B flat. And let me move these down here so it lines up nicely and is clear for your visual memorization. Our 6th mode is Aeolian. The formula is 1, 2, lowered 3rd, 4, 5, lowered 6, lowered 7, which is what we also call natural minor. C, D, E flat, F, G, A flat, B flat. And then, finally, Locrian. The formula is 1, flat 2. Sorry, not flat 2. Sometimes people will say flat 2 or sharp. I used to use those when I was learning it, but because those flats, that's only flat compared to your major scale, but if it has a flattened already, it turns into a double flat. It was just a little bit confusing. So I prefer to use nowadays lowered and raised, knowing that whatever major scale you have, you will adjust the accidental accordingly. So for Locrian, 1, lowered 2, lowered 3rd, 4, lowered 5th, lowered 6, lowered 7th, or C, D flat, E flat, F, G flat, A flat, B flat. Now, one of the things I love about music theory is that there's so many different connections you can make, both with your ear and just by looking intellectually, and those two will reinforce each other. So challenge yourself. If you say, well, in the Ionian mode, C major scale, well, it's the same as a C major scale. Well, the Dorian mode, it's the 2nd mode of a major scale. Well, in this case, challenge yourself. See how quickly you can figure out what would be the major scale, the parent major scale for this C Dorian scale. The answer would be the B flat. It's a B flat major scale starting on the note C. And if we ask the same thing here, a C Phrygian scale is from what parent major scale? The answer is A flat major scale. You'll be noticing a pattern, so that when I ask you, well, what major scale does C Lydian come from? C Lydian comes from a G major scale. What about, so let me make sure I said that correctly. So C Lydian comes from G major scale. C Mixolydian comes from an F major scale. C Aeolian comes from an E flat major scale. And C Locrian comes from a D flat major scale. Just another way to think about what we just talked about. But all these relationships are important. Now, all of this is very relevant and important information, but was important for me to go over to answer a question that was given to me by Johnny Nothing, who commented on lesson 44, which was about mode mixture. So Johnny Nothing wrote, "What if I do mode mixture not only with major and minor, but with other modes?" Well, I couldn't answer that question and have it mean anything to anyone who didn't already know about modes. Well, now you have the bare basics of modes so that I can answer this question for Johnny and the rest of you all. He gives an example. What if I will change my minor tonic to diminished triad going through Locrian mode? Will that change the function? So, absolutely that's going to change function. Let's re-examine taking these modes now and saying, well, can we use them for mode mixture? So you've heard the word mode before in lesson 44. Mainly the major mode and the minor mode, which now you know is Ionian and Aeolian. Right? So we have Ionian and Aeolian. But what if we try to get some of those other modes in the mix? What would happen? Well, Locrian is the least used of the modes because it has that diminished fifth. So if you want to use mode mixture and you're in the key of C major, and instead of C, you want to make a C diminished triad as your one chord, it's not going to sound like a one chord. Not when you're using mode mixture. It's going to sound like some kind of secondary function or some kind of chromatic harmony. It might sound like a 7 diminished of Neapolitan. And so for those of you that haven't, I do have a lesson that I talk about the Neapolitan chord, and you can understand what that is, but the Neapolitan is essentially the same thing as saying a flat 2 chord with a major sonority. It's going to be really hard to do mode mixture with Locrian, especially as a 1 chord, and actually make it sound like a 1 chord. Locrian, these modes didn't function as chords, so we're almost mixing something. So modes were used primarily as a basis for scales as the foundation of melodies. So horizontal melody. Whereas when we deal with harmony, we're talking about vertical, how things sound together. So mode is primarily horizontal, and harmony is primarily vertical. That's a gross simplification, but it will help us for this purposes. So it's going to be hard. You're going to be hard pressed. The only way you can do that is kind of modeling yourself off of what someone like Scriabin, a late 19th century composer, would do, where he would have a very dissonant 1 chord, not a triad, but he would play it, he'd play it again, he'd go away from that, he'd come back to it, and by its prominence, its frequency, its rhythmic placement, the listener's ear starts to hear this very unusual sonority that he would use sometimes in some of his compositions as a 1 chord. So it could be done, but it's going to be hard. But does pose a very intriguing question. So if normally we are in, let's say, a major key, and when we use mode mixture, it's usually borrowing, you're usually in a major key and you're borrowing from minor. That's the most common. So typically you would have a C major triad as your 1 chord, a D minor triad as your 2 chord, an E minor triad as your 3 chord, an F major triad as your 4 chord, a G major G major triad as your 5 chord, A minor as your 6 chord, and B diminished as your 7 chord. So this C major triad is common, let me spell this correctly, is what you would expect from Ionian and Lydian. Both of them have that major triad. Minor triad, well, a 2 chord in Dorian is minor. So this could be a 2 chord in Ionian, Dorian. It wouldn't be in Phrygian. It would not be a 2 chord in Lydian. It would be a 2 chord in Mixolydian. It would not be an Aeolian or Locrian. So we can go through and say, well, okay, what if we were to use what you would expect from one of these? You're basically looking for exceptions, because that's what mode mixture is about. You have something expected, a certain sonority, and instead you do something different. So it would not be uncommon that you would have a 3 chord that would be an E flat major triad. That would be mode mixed from a C Aeolian scale. So what if we were to do that? What if we were to take, let's say, and start trying to do mode mixture with Phrygian instead of Aeolian? So that would mean that C minor, so if we take Phrygian, right? Phrygian, instead of Aeolian, we try to go with Phrygian. We have our Ionian as what we're starting with. So we would have C, then we would have a D, it would be a D flat major triad here, then an E flat, because our Phrygian scale would be, we'll just write it out for reference here, C, D flat, E flat, F, G, A flat, B flat, right? So that means our 1 chord is C minor, D flat major triad, then we have an E flat major triad, which is there, then we have an F minor triad, G would be G minor, A flat major, and B flat minor. Now, even when we typically do mode mixture from an Aeolian mode, we still will make our 5 chords major, our 7 chords diminished by making them, those B flats in these cases become B naturals. So the biggest difference that jumps out for me is our 2 chord. It looks like it would be a Neapolitan chord that I was just talking about earlier. So if you were to use a lot of Neapolitan chords, and let's say use them in a way that, in terms of how they start and resolve, that functions more like a 2 chord, you might get more of that flavor. So if we have as our that's our D flat major triad. And the Neapolitan really is implying our Phrygian. And what you can do is go through these modes and break them down and look and say, well, how would it be different if I was doing mode mixture from a different mode than Aeolian? What if I was mode mixing Lydian, and all of a sudden I got these F sharps that I'm using? So there's just so much room for experimentation. In the late 19th century, people like Scriabin, people like Debussy, a lot of the Russian composers as well, French and Russian composers especially, used modes but in a tonal context. So the question that Johnny posed was very much the question that those 19th century composers were asking. How can we use this antiquated, old, modal concept, but with tonal, in a tonal setting, which is essentially what mode mixture is about. So anyways, I hope that provided you with a really interesting backstory and basis for modes, as well as answering that question about mode mixture and how mode mixture might be able to include modes other than just Ionian and Aeolian. Thank you.